Chamber. I want to welcome all of you for joining us today, including many members of the Waltham Chamber and the MetroWest Chamber who have also invited their members to join us today for a program we're titled How Immigration Policy Shifts May Impact Your Employees and Businesses. This is obviously a topic that's been on the minds of many of our employers in recent days and many of our employees. And we look forward to this conversation, and we're really grateful to the Massachusetts Immigration and Refugee Advocacy Coalition, better known as MIRA, not just for their time today, but for their work in this field for many, many years. But as we all know, this is kind of prime time. This is what we've all been, in many cases, most concerned about what would happen in this moment that we're in today. And so we're really grateful that we can get some help from Mira to think about these things. And particularly the conversation today is about how this impacts our workforce and our workplace. It's not a debate about policy. This is really just a conversation about how to best help your employees, how to support them. And want to emphasize that, we're not just talking about the needs, we're talking about workers of all sorts and all varieties, touching many different industries, including many workers who are eligible to work here, but fear being misidentified, people who are worried about their families and what it all means. This is a very wide ranging, complicated problem, far more complicated than it's often portrayed as. So we're really delighted today to have with us the executive director of MIRA, Liz Sweet, who we'll hear from in a minute, as well as Marconi Minter, who will talk about policy updates in the beginning of the presentation. And as part of the presentation, we're going to be led by Ana Cristina Chavez Andonie. And I apologize, I probably mispronounced that, Ana Cristina. But Ana Cristina joined MIRA as the first corporate executive specialist with the goal of mobilizing the business community to serve as advocacy partners. So she's working specifically with businesses and has been doing a great job communicating and helping create workshops and various things. She brings more than 5 years of experience in nonprofit advocacy and relationship management. Ana Cristina, thank you so much to you and everyone for the work that you're doing, and welcome.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Greg, and thank you everyone for being here, and thank you for taking this time in this space to really be part of a conversation about how we can support our own communities. We are all in a community interdependent of whether or not we are or not immigrants. I myself am an immigrant, and I came to this country when I was 15 years old, and I'm very proud to be part of an organization that puts these policies at its forefront. I will, without very quick, I'm going to pass it up to my director, so she may start us off, and she will run us through the updates of the immigration policies. As you probably imagine, there's been a lot of changes and a lot of very quick changes since this president held office. So I will let her start off. Thank you again, everyone, for being here today.
Thank you so much, Ana Cristina, and thank you so much to Greg and everyone at the Chamber for hosting us today. My name is Liz Sweet. I'm the MIRA Coalition's Executive Director, and I'm really pleased to be a part of this conversation with all of you. So I am going to just take a few minutes to walk through a few of the recent policy changes that we've seen from this current administration. There are a dizzying number of policy changes that have already occurred, and I'm not going to talk about every one, but we're trying to lift up some of the ones that affect larger numbers of our residents here in Massachusetts and likely many of your workers. So we can go ahead and go to the next slide. Just to very briefly introduce, Greg already spoke a little bit about MIRA. MIRA Coalition is a membership coalition, so we do count more than 150 organizational members across the Commonwealth. They range from small immigrant-led community-based organizations to some of the large refugee resettlement and other organizations that somehow serve or organize with immigrants across the state. So we, at our heart, do a lot of advocacy and organizing. We also do a lot of civic engagement work, particularly with new immigrants and immigrants who newly become citizens here in the Commonwealth. And our vision at MIRA is a Commonwealth and a nation where all can thrive, no matter where they came from or how they got here, and all can fully participate in their community's social, economic, and civic life. So that's just a little bit about MIRA. But we can go ahead and dive in. Again, we're not going to nearly touch on every policy change that's happening because we would be here all day and you all would not want to sit through that. But we do want to pick up just a few highlights. So if we can go to the first slide. This one we're always mentioning right now because it's such a deep potential change that the administration did set out to make a change to birthright citizenship, which is something that's been long established in US constitutional law. And this is not currently in effect, but this is an executive order. There have already been many lawsuits against it, including one filed by our own Attorney General here in Massachusetts. And those lawsuits thus far have very clearly found this to be unconstitutional. However, we do flag this because it would affect large numbers of individuals if it does stay in place. So again, this would be, just very briefly, it would be denying citizenship when a child is born in this country where the mother has no status or only has temporary status, and if the father is not a citizen or a green card holder. So we can go on to the next slide now. Another very significant change that's been made that affects large numbers of individuals here in Massachusetts is that we've had something in our laws for a long time called expedited removal. And expedited removal allows for immigration to arrest someone and deport them very quickly from this country. That's the name, expedited removal. And it means that the person doesn't see a judge and have an opportunity to make a case the way that they more traditionally would if someone is arrested. And so it's now, under this current law, been extended to cover anyone picked up within 100 miles of the border who's been here up to 2 years. And so what's interesting about this is we don't always think of ourselves this way, but basically all of New England, basically all of Massachusetts falls within that 100 miles of the border between the Canadian border and the ocean. And so this means that anyone who's been here for less than 2 years without a clear legal status could be at risk of being immediately arrested and deported without any opportunity to go to a judge. So this is a very significant change in our law. And of course, what concerns us is the risk that this could be applied to people who do have legal status, who just aren't able to clearly demonstrate that in the moment. Okay, we can go on to the next slide. This one, I think, is one that so many of us are very aware is a change that's going to affect a lot of people in Massachusetts and a lot of workers here in the state. So the administration has ended many of the parole programs that the Biden administration had put in place and is attempting to end temporary protected status for several different groups. And so parole programs include the Uniting for Ukraine program that Biden had put into place. It includes parole for Haitians, for Venezuelans, and others. For temporary protected status, we have very significant numbers of Haitians in particular here in Massachusetts who currently have temporary protected status. Some of you may be familiar with this because it is a lawful status, right, that someone becomes eligible for 18 months that gives them a work permit. And so there are many folks here in the Commonwealth who've been working with this status. And the administration has now said that they're going to end it 6 months early. They've also said that they're going to have Venezuelan TPS expire on April 7th, which is coming up very quickly. And so this affects many workers in our state right now who may be losing status. The Venezuelan TPS ending has already been challenged in a lawsuit. We expect that there will be a lawsuit challenging the end of Haitian TPS, but there's no guarantee of how either of those lawsuits will play out right now. And Mira's estimate is that for the Haitian TPS, this likely affects well over 15,000 individuals here in Massachusetts. Okay, we can go on to the next slide. And then we have to talk about immigration enforcement, of course, because this was such a significant message from this administration, is that they're going to be doing mass deportations. So far, we have not seen that kind of true mass deportation or raid, at least here in Massachusetts, that some of us worry may be coming. However, as you can see on this slide, they've laid the groundwork through a number of different ways to be prepared to start to carry out this type of activity. And so they've rescinded a number of memos that used to apply to Immigration and Customs Enforcement's work, notably the sensitive locations memo. This was a direction that ICE would not carry out enforcement activities in churches or houses of worship, at hospitals, at schools, etc. That those would be sort of safe spaces that people could access without worrying about coming into contact with immigration enforcement. So that no longer exists. They also rescinded what was called the priorities memo. And that memo had laid out that certain individuals, particularly individuals with past criminal convictions, people who had trafficked, etc., were higher priorities, that ICE should be looking for those individuals and not looking for the ordinary person, who is, living and working here, granted without status. But by eliminating this memo, everyone is an equal target now to this administration. And finally, at the bottom, I have to note, because I think this is so important, we're still seeing the federal budget play out a little bit, but both the House and the Senate have now included very significant increased funds for immigration enforcement, basically doubling the amount of money going for immigration enforcement in this country, allowing for expanded detention beds and so much more. So they very much have set up a situation where we expect more enforcement activity to be coming. Again, we have not seen any true raid yet here in Massachusetts. We have seen some small enforcement activities of ICE showing up at Market Basket, ICE showing up at a couple of workplaces, etc. So we are seeing activity, but not that high level raid so far. So we can go on to the next slide. And this one, of course, is why we're here. We at MIRA Coalition think that business is such a key partner in talking about how important immigrants are in Massachusetts and in our region. They are, we can go to the next slide. They are a huge portion of our workforce here in Massachusetts. 21.8% of workers in our labor force are immigrants, disproportionate to their share of the population. There are so many sectors of the economy, of course, that disproportionately have immigrants. Likely many of you know this, beyond some of the sectors mentioned here. There are many specific jobs where there are disproportionate numbers of immigrants in some of those roles. And so what happens if we lose some of those folks, how certain industries will continue filling those jobs is a real concern for us at MIRA. We also have, just briefly, we have some great statistics here, also just showing some of the contributions. Immigrants pay $18.4 billion in total taxes, and are paying huge amounts in rent, etc. So we have a lot more data on this if anyone would like more details about the economic contributions that immigrants make nationally and here in Massachusetts. But with that, I'm going to turn over to my colleague, Ana Cristina, to lead the next part, and just want to, again, thank you all so much for being here.
Yeah, Liz, and before we go back to Ana Cristina, thank you so much for the work you're doing and for being with us today. I did want to mention, everyone, we are recording the presentation portion of this program, but we will not record the Q&A afterwards. In case anyone has any questions they would feel more comfortable asking without being recorded, you can also ask your questions during the chat. And thank you both. Ana Cristina, it's all yours.
Thank you, Greg, and thank you, Liz, for starting us off. I just see that there is a question in the chat about, oh, the statistics that we shared today were specifically about the state of Massachusetts. And as Liz mentioned, if there is interest in getting more of that general national data, we can certainly facilitate in finding that for you all as well. So I wanted to part of this presentation, when we are thinking about how we can protect ourselves and our employees in the workplace, I think it is important to just understand an overview of what is the system that is working with these kind of mechanisms. So I wanted to start with an overview of what the immigration system is in the United States under the Department of Homeland Security. And many of you may know this already, and I will be very brief with this. So essentially, we have three main agencies. We have Immigrations and Customs Enforcement, which we know as ICE. We have Customs and Border Protection, and then which also can be known as CBP. And we have the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, which I use in immigration. There's a lot of acronyms, and we say USCIS. Liz mentioned previously how an expedited removal, she mentioned how there can be enforcement within 100 miles of the border. And so starting with Customs and Border Patrol, they are essentially the immigration police on all the borders of the United States. And that includes oceans and the Canadian border, not just the Mexican border. They are also the officers that are all the ports of entry and at the airport. And if anyone has ever driven from Texas to Arizona or any one of those border states, you will more than likely pass through several checkpoints already on the US side of the border. So again, that's the police inside. Now, for the purposes of this conversation today, the agents for immigration that we will most likely be referring to will be ICE agents. So they are the police, essentially immigration police that operate in the interior of the United States. And as we know, they are the ones that can arrest individuals to deport, and they also represent the government in immigration proceedings. Now, the third agency, which is United States Citizenship and Immigration Services, they are the ones that review a lot of the applications that are filed with the immigration office, which is what a lot of folks might hear say. They conduct interviews for asylum, for green cards, for citizenship. They can grant status to people that qualify, but they can very well sometimes deny applications. There are circumstances in which, when sometimes there are applications that are denied, they will then sometimes refer those cases to ICE to then enforce those denials and deport people. That sometimes happens. I can't answer specifics as to when that will and won't happen, but that has happened before. Now, there are many ways that people can come into contact with immigration and at the end be deported. Many people, for example, at the border, when they're trying to enter the United States without valid documents, that's the reason that some folks can end up being deported. ICE officers can also arrest folks that have already been in the United States for a long period of time. One of the most common ways that people can come into contact with ICE is contact with the criminal justice system, and especially traffic stops when someone is driving and then through that end they are arrested for some sort of traffic violation. And once that person's fingerprints are in the system, ICE they can flag ICE's radar. Now, one of the things that can happen as well is if there's any sort of ICE enforcement, and what we call then folks can get accidentally swept into that enforcement. That's another way that folks can get into ICE's radar. Sometimes if you have a green card and you're coming back into the country, and maybe you stayed outside of the country slightly longer than your green card allows you to, or maybe you had some sort of criminal record and then you left the country and came back, that is another way that you can come into contact with ICE. So who is at risk at deportation? And I wanted to address this because, as we have mentioned, there can be really vulnerable populations as to who can be at risk. What I do want people to understand is that anyone that is not a US citizen, bottom line, can be vulnerable if they fall under a ground of deportation, such as a criminal charge, or maybe someone has what we say a prior order of deportation. So what I'm saying with that is maybe someone was ordered deported by a judge, but they didn't leave the country, or they left the country but came back. Now, People can also be deported by having status, by having a criminal charge, or they can be deported simply for not having any status at all. Sometimes if there can be folks that submit applications to a judge or USCIS, and if you have an application on file, you can kind of pause the process of you being deported if you are currently going through the deportation system in front of a judge or with USCIS. What's important to highlight here is that most immigrants already inside the US have a right to due process and cannot be ordered deported without first having a hearing in immigration court. Now, this is kind of, I would say, like the meat of the presentation today, is just knowing what our rights are and knowing what your rights are as employers and how to protect your employees. As Greg mentioned in the beginning, we want to make sure that people feel safe enough to come to work, and just knowing the power and the privilege that you have as employers and how can we use that for the greater good of our employees, right? So what I want to highlight again is that there is this misconception and narrative that if you are not a US citizen or you are an immigrant, you don't have rights in this country. And that is not true. Everyone living in the United States has certain basic rights that are in the US Constitution, regardless of immigration status. And it's important to know this because knowing this, I do believe, can empower folks to assert those rights. And you can also help protect folks whose rights are being violated as well. What I want to drop here before we go into the next slides is there are these really useful red cards that were created by the ILRC, and they essentially have in English on one side the 5 rights that someone has, and on the other side it can be in the language of that person. We have them in Spanish, in English, in Portuguese, in French. And in these types of interactions with enforcement, it can be extremely scary and nerve-wracking to remember that you have the right to remain silent. You have the right to not open the door without a warrant, that you have the right to not sign anything that you don't understand. So these red cards can be really useful if you wanted to inquire about ordering them through us to give to your staff, so that in the event of interaction, they can simply hand the card to an agent. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that the agents will respect those rights, but those rights can be asserted. Now, I think the big question that we all have here, right? So in the event, and I do want to emphasize that, as Liz has mentioned, we haven't seen a high level of activity in terms of workplace enforcement as of yet. But in the event that this happens, and in the event that immigration comes to your work, there's I would say 2 main types of immigration actions in work. One can be a raid, which is usually as a result of an investigation into the employer, or it can be targeted enforcement, in which ICE agents are already looking for a specific person and they've inquired as to where they work, and they might come into that area of work asking about that employer. So what is the most important thing to do? First step is that if an agent is trying to knock on your door, if it's a closed door business, or they come into a public area of your business, the most important thing to do is to, if there's a door, to not open the door immediately, or to ask for a judicial warrant signed by a judge, which I will show pictures of in the next few slides. You will ask the officers to identify themselves by asking them explicitly if they are ICE. They might say they're police, but it's important to have them identify if they are with Immigration and Customs Enforcement. And then you will ask for them to show you a warrant, and but they have to show it to you physically. They might say that it's in the car. They might say that another agent has it. It is very important that you see with your own eyes if they have a warrant signed by a judge. Now, if for whatever reason an ICE agent does have a judicial warrant, which I do want to emphasize is very, very rare, you want to make sure that every information on the warrant is correct. If that warrant is for search warrant for your place of business, making sure that the address is correct and making sure that it's signed by a judge. If they have a warrant for an individual, then making sure that if that person's name is correct, that person's address is correct. And I will teach you how to recognize a judicial warrant. Now, the really important thing to do here in those first minutes is understanding that there can be a period of delay whatever employee is the one that first comes into contact with ICE, they are allowed to say, I don't have permission to talk to you. Let me call my employer, which should be one of the quickest things to do, is making sure that you get your employer or your direct supervisor on the line and assigning what I like to call a point person. So if there can be a point person in every ship that knows these procedures that I just spoke about, that knows that the first things to do is to ask if they have a warrant and then to say that they don't have permission to speak to them until they get you, their employer, to speak to them. That waiting period allows you to maybe call your immigration lawyer, call your employment lawyer, make sure that your employees are aware of what's going on. So on the screen, you're going to see examples. You're going to see two examples of warrants. On your left-hand side, you're going to see a warrant signed by a judge. On your left-hand side, you're going to see an immigration warrant. Now, immigration officers, as I mentioned, they rarely have a warrant that's signed by a judge. Instead, they usually have what is an immigration warrant called Warrant for Arrest of Alien, and it will usually say U.S. Department of Homeland Security. Now, this warrant will not be signed by a judge. It will be signed by an ICE agent or by an ICE field director or by an ICE supervisor. Now, while this gives them the authority to detain an individual named, it does not give them permission to enter that individual's home or enter your workplace to detain said individual. Now, what I do want to emphasize is, while ICE might show up with a judicial arrest warrant for an individual in your workplace, which again is rare, they still need a search warrant for your workplace to enter to look for that specific individual. So again, those examples are very rare, but I do want folks to know that just if for whatever reason they show up with an arrest warrant for an individual, they still need permission to enter your area of work to detain said individual. Now, I want to talk here about what your rights as an employer are as it pertains to I-9 audits and no-match letters and a little bit of responsibilities. I won't go super into detail on this because, as I understand, I know that there may have been an employment immigration attorney that's maybe spoken to you, but what I do want to highlight here is that in the event that there is an I-9 audit to your business, you do not need to hand over requested documents immediately. There is a 72-hour rule once you get that notice of inspection. Whatever files that you are requested, we recommend, and this is also on the advice of the American Business Immigration Council, to only turn over the files that are requested and to make copies of those files before you do so, to make sure that you are protecting your employees' data as much as possible. Now, there are, and I'm sure many folks here have heard of this, of what is called a no-match letter by a Social Security Administration. Now, that is usually a notification that employee records provided for an employee don't match the information in Social Security. But what I really want to highlight here is that information received from those no-match letters is not making any statement about that person's immigration status. Now, taking adverse action against an employee only for the sole reason of receiving a no-match letter could potentially expose you to legal action because it may be a violation of state and federal law. So we really caution employees against taking actions against employees solely as a result of a no-match letter. Now, Liz did mention previously that there are, like, especially for parole and TPS, there's going to be a lot of uncertainty in the next few months, and then there's a lot of people whose statuses is going to be up in jeopardy. What I do still want to make sure that people are aware of is that for some folks that are working here with permission, with what we call employee authorization documents, and I usually call these EAD cards. They're these little kind of red cards, and they have a category as to under what category they're allowed to work. In December 2024, there was a final rule that increased what we call an extension period for employment authorization, but only for certain categories. That might not apply to some of your workers, but the reason I'm mentioning this is because maybe you are shown an employment authorization card that expire, say, today, Thursday, February 27th, but their category actually falls under one of those categories that was automatically extended. So what I really want to highlight here again is that what we can see sometimes on paper might not be representative of that person's authorization to work legally and to do that due diligence before taking action against that employee. Now, want to talk a little bit again about what is the role of an employer, or what can be the role of an employer in this situation. So when we are preparing for an ICE action, what we would recommend doing is making sure that we do this ahead of time. So making a written response plan ahead of time and develop that policy in place with your leadership, and making sure that your workers know what that plan is and to practice it like an actual fire drill. And I don't mean this to cause panic, but because we know that when we practice something beforehand, in the event that that moment actually does happen, we're going to be overwhelmed with nerves. We're going to be scared. We're going to be worried about our employees. So it's going to be a lot easier to enact those policies to protect your staff if you already know what it is that you're doing beforehand instead of reacting to that. Make sure that you are training your workers not to talk to ICE agents under any circumstances. Again, referring to that one point person on shift. And if that point person on your shift can be someone that has more of a protective legal status, that will allow them to feel safer in doing that. And making sure that ahead of the time, your workers know what their rights are. That is extremely important. Now, in the event that ICE agents arrive to your workplace, training your workers to say that they do not give them, that the workers say they can't give agents permission to enter, that you must speak to my employer. And training all workers to not interact with ICE agents. In the event that ICE arrives, it is very important to stay calm. And I know that that can sound kind of futile, because how can someone stay calm in this situation? But the calmer someone is, the easier it will be to recall what the actions are. And the more calm your workers are, the less likely that ICE will then say that they had a probable suspicion to go after your workers. So for example, making sure that your workers know to not immediately run if an ICE agent comes into the workplace, because that might put your worker at risk for having ICE go after them and detaining them. Making sure that you as an employer are requesting that proper documentation from ICE agents as well, making sure that you're verifying that it's a warrant, making sure that you're getting legal counsel on the phone to verify the scope of whatever warrant those agents have. And most importantly here is making sure that we are limiting ICE's access to non-public, or what we call private areas. So what are public and private areas in the workplace? So if ICE agents enter a public area of business, so what I want to say here is a waiting area, a dining area in a restroom, a lobby, a parking lot. If it's a car mechanic shop, the outside area where maybe the cars are being parked and the workers are working on the cars, but you are technically in a public area. If there are ICE agents in that public area, you as the employer can still say, I am the employer and you may not go into other areas of the workplace without my permission. Now, as for the private areas, no one can enter, not even myself, a private area of your business without your permission. If I go to a restaurant, I cannot enter the kitchen, I cannot enter an office space without permission of that employer. Something we really want to make sure people understand, and that's the best practice, is marking those areas really, really clearly and keeping those areas locked during business hours, or restricting access to those areas as much as possible. If ICE agents try to enter a public area, then you say, this is a private area. You cannot enter without a judicial warrant. Do you have a judicial warrant? Now, what is important to do here is that if they say they might have a copy, they have a judicial warrant, ask to see it and ask to read it. You can accept that warrant, but you can still decline to consent to the search. But again, having a search warrant, ICE agents with those types of warrants is very rare. Now, again, to that point person, in the event that this happens, assigning someone per shift that that are responsible for confirming the warrant and getting the employer on the phone or on site, and making sure that they have the contact information for management, for legal. And they could also be responsible, should they feel safe to write down the names and badge members of those ICE agents. The reason for being is that while ICE agents might not always respect the rights of the employer and employee, it is important to know when those rights are being violated, because then that can be something that can be taken action. So pulling back a little bit into stopping you in public. And I wanted to touch on this because I have heard a lot of concerns of employees, from employers about, well, what about when my employee is walking to their car? I was at a presentation recently for a company that they employ a lot of home aides. And they asked, well, what about when my employee is walking to their car from a client's house? And so this applies to all sorts of public interactions, but again, staying calm and not resisting. Because ICE doesn't need a judicial warrant to detain you in public, this is when it is extremely important to remain silent and ask if you are under arrest or if you are free to leave. Do not give them any sort of information about where you are from, what other languages you speak, because that will give them any sort of reasonable suspicion that they might then categorize you as someone that is not allowed to be here, like Greg mentioned at the beginning of the presentation. It is important here when I say stay calm, especially in public, is because if you are to run, they will have a reasonable suspicion and they will try to run after you and then arrest you. It is extremely important that if you are over the age of 18 and you have valid immigration documents, to have those documents on you. If you or someone you know or your employees doesn't feel safe carrying those documents on you, like my partner doesn't feel safe carrying his green card on him because it's a very valuable document, but we have a picture of it and I have one on my phone and he has a laminated copy. So thinking about those things you can do ahead of time. I really want to emphasize here is that never providing false documents to an agent is extremely important here, because these can have really, really negative consequences on that person's immigration case or immigration status down the line. And if they decide that what you're giving them is false, they can then detain you for that as well. Now, speaking more from the lens of like as allies, and maybe we have status, we have green cards, or we're citizens. If we see ICE in public and we feel safe taking these actions, it's important to again verify, confirm that they're agents and not an ICE agents and not a different type of enforcement, right? Paying attention to those words on your uniform. And the reason I am directing this to us here on this call is because it wouldn't be fair to ask your workers that might not feel safe to do so to do these types of steps as well. If you are in that position of privilege that you can do these actions and protect your communities, we encourage you to do so. If you feel safe to do so, taking videos or photos of what the officers are doing and making sure you write down what's the time, date, and exact location of the encounter. To share this information, please only share information that's been verified, because we do want to limit the amount of, fear just for the purpose of fear as possible. We do not want to add any more undue stress or fear or anxiety. Now, to this effect, a couple of weeks ago, I had an employer call me and she said, my employee saw agents at this train station. So I got that from and then the employee came on the phone and she shared that with me. But then when I asked her, were there ICE agents or police, she wasn't too clear. So again, just making sure that when you have that information and you want to verify it, write down as much information as you feel comfortable doing, and then try to verify that with a trusted source or an organization that is very well connected to response efforts. Now, reviewing just a bit in terms of how we can protect our staff in this workplace. So most importantly, right, coming up with a company-wide plan for how to respond to an ICE raid or a targeted enforcement, and communicating that with your staff, and not just communicating the plan, but communicating resources ahead of time for your staff. So Mira's website has a lot of Know Your Rights posters and flyers. making sure that those are in the break room, making sure that they have access to a printer so that they can print those resources and have them on them or in their place of work. Finding a qualified immigration lawyer. There is an organization that specifically partners with employers and employees to assess other types of business immigration relief. And if that is something that you as an employer feel that you have the capacity to do for your employee, we encourage you to check out their website as well. But the point of putting this in is to keep in mind that if you as an employer have the resources or the connections to connect your employees to a nonprofit or to maybe a private attorney that can help them or give them an immigration assessment, making sure that you are connecting your employees to as many resources as you can if you have the capacity to do so. In the event of an ICE raid, again, making sure that you determine if ICE has a warrant signed by a judge, not an ICE officer or field director. I want to emphasize here that if an ICE agent comes to a place of your work and all they have is an ICE warrant, you do not have the legal obligation to bring out that employer and present it to the ICE agent, the employee. You do not need to confirm with that agent if that worker is present at work that day or not. You do not have to do that as an employer. That is your right to not do so. And again, making sure you're writing down as much information as possible and remaining calm, making sure your people know to not talk to any ICE agents, and making sure that folks aren't running away during this circumstance. What I really want to focus on here as well is once something like this happens, it can be extremely traumatizing for your workers. And how can we develop policies to support our employees in the aftermath of a raid or targeted enforcement, right? So one of the options could be you can offer your workers affected leave while they're trying to figure out their work situation, while they're trying to figure out more work options. Give them that affected leave and or maybe allowing them to return to that position if they have to leave that position for a period of time. Making sure that you are paying them their wages and their benefits owed so that when they come back, they still have that salary. Contributing to an immigration legal fund or contributing to organizations that provide direct services for this as well and connecting them to said organization. If your employees have to leave or they have to go to, maybe they're detained, maybe they have to go somewhere else because they're scared, letting them know that you are able to be a job reference for them for any future opportunities of employment. And the other thing that I will say is making sure that you are staying connected to your community's immigration response efforts. I know that we have several chambers. We have members from different chambers on this call today. So knowing like if I am in Waltham, who is the organization that is connected to rapid response? If I am in Brookline, who is here that is connected to rapid response? How can I start having relationships in the event that if something happens, I can connect with them immediately? And the last couple of things I wanted to just talk on before I pass it on to our amazing political director is keeping in mind that if something like this happens and someone is detained, it can have a huge impact on their family, and knowing that there are resources out there that can help people make informed decisions as to how to take care of their family in the event of deportation. So there is this really amazing Massachusetts family preparedness packet that is linked in the slides that can help guide those conversations as to how to take care for your children's needs, educational, medical needs in a person's absence. And it can also offer folks a tool to have that conversation about reunification, whether if it's the family goes to that person's country where they were deported to, or if they choose to stay. But making sure that your employees know that there are resources to help in the aftermath is extremely important for our well-being as well. And lastly, I want to drop this here for just immigration legal resources for folks, especially for folks that are living in fear because of their status and they just want to know, and maybe they're not, but they want to know what their options are, especially for maybe you have employees that have TPS and they need to explore what their options are. So here is the legal services directory in Massachusetts, and and we also have a legal services directory outside of Massachusetts in case there's anyone else that needs to find an immigration attorney. The city of Boston does offer short free consultations, and the immigration court list also has some pro bono services. Now, what is not in this slide, but what I do want to mention is that there's only two types of people that can offer folks immigration advice. One of those is a lawyer, and you can always look them up with their state to make sure that they're qualified to practice in the state. And the other one is what's called an accredited representative. And they are usually an individual that works for a nonprofit that is given special authority and training by the US Department of Homeland Security to practice immigration law. And accredited representatives usually cannot charge or only charge a very small amount. The reason I say this is because there has been a lot of cases where notary publics or other individuals that are not authorized to practice law are indeed practicing law or are giving legal advice and are really jeopardizing people's immigration case. So I want to mention this to you in case you hear of an employee saying, well, I have someone to help me on my case, but maybe they say that it's a notary, maybe they call themselves an immigration assistant, maybe they call themselves, an interpreter, but the only people that are allowed to give folks immigration advice or legal and in the immigration context is a lawyer or an accredited representative. And with that, I'm going to pass it on to my political director, Maroni Minter, and we will talk about how MIRA is advocating at the state level and how you all can get involved with us.
And Anna, just before you do that, for everybody, we have a lot of questions in the chat, and Liz has been answering them. So if you have questions that we're not going to get time to ask live, go into the chat and we'll do our best to get answers for you. So we can do it that way. Thank you.
Thank you, AC. And thank you, Liz, for answering all the questions that are coming in the chat. Hello, everybody. My name is Maroni Minter. I am the political director here at MIRA. And I am also a proud immigrant, born and raised in Gabon, which is a very, very small country on the west coast of Africa. I've been in the US for 20 years, moved here in 2004. And I have mostly spent my time in Vermont and just moved here to Massachusetts about 8 months ago now. So very excited to be here. As you've heard from AC, what you heard from Anna is part of protecting our immigrant communities campaign, right? Part of this is being able to share these resources, know your right training, and so forth. But what we also do at MIRA is we are an advocacy organization. And so as part of protecting our immigrant community campaign, which was launched a few weeks ago, again, we are focusing on, in terms of our advocacy work, we are working to pass 2 key legislation that would protect immigrant communities here in Massachusetts. And the first bill is something we've been working on for years now, and some of you may have heard of it, and that is the Safe Communities Act. And this is a bill that would limit the participation of our police, our courts, and our correctional facilities and federal immigration enforcement, while also guaranteeing basic rights. It would really, what it would do, it would ban law enforcement from questioning about someone's immigration status and enabling immigrant workers, domestic violence survivors, tenants, and others to be able to report exploitation and abuse and other crimes to law enforcement without fear of immigration consequences. And the second bill is the Immigrant Legal Defense Act. And this is a newly introduced bill. We introduced in this legislative session. And what it does is really, it looks to improve access to fair and equitable legal representation for low-income Massachusetts immigrants in deportation proceedings. So this is what it's a big deal, right? Because we know that despite the complexity of the US immigration laws, there is no right to a government-paid lawyer in immigration court. And so we know that immigrants who cannot afford a lawyer are forced to navigate this complex system alone, and sometimes leaving them highly vulnerable to deportation. And so the bill will create a program with public and private funding to provide, again, low-cost legal services to low-income immigrants in deportation proceedings. And these funds, our hope is that they will be distributed through one single coordinator to ensure the fairness and efficiency in allocation. So those are the two bills that we are really pushing hard. And so, we're trying to build a coalition to be successful. And so we would love for you all to also get involved. Ways for you to get involved right now is by reaching out to your legislators and urging them to endorse and support these bills. And there's a QR code that you can use to do that. But we also invite you to join the campaign, right? We would love for you to join the campaign coalition. Something for you to consider. We meet bi-weekly, and this is where you get update on how these bills are moving, and also get update on what actions you can take or what action you can share with your community that they can take to be able to help move these bills forward. So I will stop there. I know we're running out of time, but just want to stop there to see if there are any questions regarding these two bills that I just talked about.
Thank you very much, Maroni. Anyone have questions? First, Liz, thanks for answering a lot of them in the chat. But anyone have any questions right now, we can ask them live, or you can put them in the chat. So. If not, I guess the question I wanted to ask, and you mentioned a little bit, Cristina, was about the fear that persists right now, the concern that perhaps the way rumors are spreading through communities, what the role social media has. How does someone verify or get a perspective on what's real and what's not real? And I guess, we just heard from the administration's borders are saying they're going to come after Boston. I can only imagine that's creating more fear and more concern. So help us understand how we think about that.
That's a great question, Greg, and I'm very happy that you're raising that. I think that I understand the inclination as we receive these types of news and alerts, and we want to share them, we want to spread them on social media, but we really want to be careful because there's already so much fear going on with headlines and everything all over the news. And as you said, like what the border czar has been doing, like he went on TV recently and said, I'm going to give Boston hell. And that inspired a lot of fear. So what we really recommend is
We lost Anna there. Liz, you want to maybe try to pick up on that? You're on mute, though.
Yeah, why don't I just jump in a little bit and hopefully we get Ana Cristina back. Yeah, we all want to do what we can to minimize the fear and panic. Something that I was actually going to add that Ana Cristina did not mention yet is that this Know Your Rights information really does work. We actually know of at least 2 different businesses in Massachusetts where ICE has shown up to that business and the person, someone at the business was prepared. They knew their rights, they used this kind of information and plan, and they sent ICE away in the absence of a warrant. And so I do, want to very much emphasize that, these kinds of strategies that we were talking through can work and can lead to a much safer experience for everyone. And so I think that's really important for us to name here. Maroni, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I just want to also add, I think part of it, Greg, it's why it's really important for you all of us to be those trusted messengers, right? So you all being here, getting these information, getting these resources, you have built those trusted relationship with the community members, right? And so it's really, really important that we all be those trusted messengers sharing these resources. At the end of the day, there are so much out there, right? So much misinformation. And also in terms of what the current administration is doing, right? There are things that they are doing that are legal and some things that are not legal, right? So being able to explain what is happening, and again, being those trusted messengers in our community is very, very important. And so you all being part of this conversation and hopefully sharing all these resources really goes a long way. So Anna, welcome back.
Yeah, thank you. Everybody in the
Thank you,
audience,
I'm
just raise
sorry.
your hand if you have a question. But Ana Cristina, you want to finish what you were saying before you?
Yes, I'm so sorry. The outlet I was charging my computer on just apparently was not working.
Okay.
But I just wanted to finish on saying that while I understand that folks want to spread what's going on, we always want to make sure that we verify first. So we usually recommend reaching out to a trusted organization that you already know is very much in the loop with movement that's going on. And then we can then reach out. There's been times that we ask about enforcement, and then we're able to reach out to our contacts with folks we know to verify that as well.
I'm guessing there's not people taking a lot of vacations at Mirror these days. I'm guessing it's not a lot of days off. I'd love to just understand what it's like and how you're kind of coping with this moment. And maybe Liz, you can start. I know you've been there a couple of years now, and love to hear from everybody on it. But what is it like working in the trenches right now at this moment?
We are busy. You're absolutely right, Greg. It is interesting. I mean, I'm someone who has been working in the immigrant rights space for about 20 years now, and we've seen so many different moments where so many of us have felt like we've had to step up. In the first Trump administration, I was involved in some of the lawsuits about the refugee and Muslim ban, and that was another really intense time. But I have to say, honestly, that I have not experienced something at this level of intensity that we're at right now. And I don't say that lightly, right? But the sort of flurry of changes and the level of fear that's happening in communities because of it really does feel unprecedented to me. And I think we at Mira feel so motivated on a personal level to step up and just do everything we can right now. So not so many vacations, you're right.
Ronnie or Ana Cristina, you want to give us your own perspective on what it's like at this moment?
Yeah, I think it's a very good question. I think it's interesting as that we actually had our director's retreat yesterday, and one of the things that I shared during that retreat was that honestly, after election, right, like that week, right after presidential election, I felt hopeless. I felt like, well, what is the point, right? But also kind of stepping back and realizing the enormity of this work, right? How important this work is, and the people, the communities that we serve and fight for, who depend on us doing this work, who depend on our voices, and so it's really come upon us to even step up, right? There's this urgency. But also, Greg, just understanding and seeing how the work that we do is appreciated really gives us hope, and also again speaks that to the urgency to step up even more, right? We want to be bold, we want to be loud, we don't want to back down. At the end of the day, I think that's what um, the other side would like to see us do, right? Stand down, but there's no time for that right now. We have to step up our advocacy effort. And again, there are for us who have the privilege, right, like myself, to be a citizen. It's very important that we speak for those who cannot speak up right now. So that's just where we are.
Great, Ana Cristina.
Greg, that's a great question. And thank you for posing that. I feel similarly to Moroni in the sense that I am a very recent citizen. I've been a citizen for just over 2 years now, even though I've been in this country for a long time. And I think that Mira's leadership has done an amazing job of making sure that we as a staff feel supported so we can keep doing this very hard work, because it's work that not only are we seeing every day up close and personal, but we're also hearing about it every day, right? When we step out with headlines. I know for myself in my role, like when I'm talking to business owners and entrepreneurs and sectors every day, it's a very real fear. And I will say something that I find extremely heartening is the concern about our about their employees and about their staff, because it's not just if maybe their employees are immigrants, but maybe their consumers are immigrants, right? And I have been really pulled up in that way, because sometimes it's the opposite experience, right? Sometimes some folks only see their employees as like a way to make money, and I have been really pleased, at least very much here in Boston and Massachusetts, that people are very much in solidarity with each other. But also at Mira, a lot of us are immigrants, and so we feel such a sense of community as well, to know that we not only understand this because of our training in our role, but we all in a way have some sort of story and experience that allows us to be able to then communicate what we're hearing to our external partners. And in that sense, like, one of the amazing ways to get involved with Mira is right now we're facing some obstacles, we're facing like with the federal funding cuts, and we're also trying to figure out how can we support our members as well in this situation. And in my role as corporate engagement, one of the things we talk about is how can we get folks to engage with Mira a little bit more, in what capacity. And so recently one of our restaurant partners hosted like a little benefit night for us, and it was very, very nice. The place was able to be packed, and we're gonna have several other events this year. We're gonna have an immigrant day at the State House in March, and that's entirely free, and we really encourage people to show up. You can bring your employees. It's gonna be about half the day. We're also gonna have our big fundraiser in May. So there's many ways to support Mira. Every dollar counts, especially right now, because as Liz and Ronnie have mentioned, like, we are very much in the fight, in the trenches, on all levels, be it on the ground all the way up to the State House. So
Great.
that's a very long answer, but to say, like, thank you so much for having us here.
Well, thank you very much, and all of you and everybody who's listening, who is an employer who's dealing with these things or working with as an HR role. We need to remind ourselves to make sure we do the self-care that we need to make sure that we can stand up for others. So thank you both for your time, and everybody for watching, and we're really happy to have the Waltham Chamber and the MetroWest Chamber join us today. Have a great day, everybody.